The moment you wake up, your brain transitions from a predominantly offline state, characterized by slow wave activity and suppressed sensory input, to one of rapid re-engagement with the external world. This transition is governed by a dynamic interplay between various neuromodulators, including cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Among these, the ability to direct attention, both visually and cognitively, is the first true act of agency available to you. And that act holds more power than most people realize. Attention is not a passive filter, it is an active selection mechanism. Where you place your attention literally changes the firing patterns of your neurons, the release of your neurochemicals, and the architecture of your brain over time. When you say to yourself each morning, "I control where I place my attention," you're engaging a fundamental truth of human neurobiology. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral and anterior cingulate regions, governs what's called top-down control. That means it allows you to override default states, distraction, stress, or inertia, and direct focus deliberately. This ability isn't a given, it is a skill that can be trained and sharpened. And like any skill, the quality and consistency of its practice determine the outcomes you experience throughout the day. Attention is a gatekeeper. What you attend to becomes your experience of reality. Neuroscience shows us that even though your sensory organs take in vast amounts of information, your brain only processes what you focus on. In fact, more than 90% of what you see, hear, and feel is discarded before it reaches conscious awareness. So in a very real sense, attention edits your world. When your attention is scattered, your experience becomes chaotic. When your attention is directed, your actions become precise. Upon waking, your brain is in a vulnerable state. Cortisol levels are rising, which is normal and necessary. It's called the cortisol awakening response. This helps mobilize energy and alertness, but it also makes the mind more susceptible to programming. What you focus on in this first hour isn't just a choice. It becomes a blueprint. If your attention is pulled immediately into email, social media, or the chaos of incoming demands, you begin your day in a reactive mode. This triggers the brain's default mode network and activates circuits of comparison, judgment, and passive thought loops. However, if you take a moment to claim your attention, to say aloud or firmly think, "I control where I place my attention," you begin to close that loop. You activate the salience network, which includes the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, and these regions help the brain prioritize what matters. This creates coherence between your goals and your focus. In that state, you're no longer bouncing between distractions. You're primed to take deliberate, directed action. You can further reinforce this by combining the mental statement with a physical behavior. For example, anchoring your vision, deliberately looking at a fixed point in the distance, engages the circuitry of the frontal eye fields and superior colliculus, both of which are linked to attention and motor planning. That act of visual targeting sends signals to the brain that it's time to engage, not wander. It's one of the fastest ways to shift from internal narrative to external control. There's a direct relationship between eye position and mental state. When your eyes are scanning aimlessly, your mind tends to follow suit. But when your eyes are locked onto a target, especially one that is outside your immediate reach, your brain prepares for movement, for challenge, for engagement. This creates a sympathetic tone in your autonomic nervous system, increasing alertness and readiness. You're no longer just awake, you're operational. Attention also controls neuroplasticity. Your brain doesn't change because you experience something. It changes because you attend to it. Synapses don't strengthen just because something happened. They strengthen because your brain flagged it as important. That flag is attention. If you want to build new habits, learn new skills, or change your emotional responses, attention is the currency that funds that change. Without it, there's no reinforcement, no encoding, no transformation. Saying, "I control where I place my attention," reminds the brain that it is not merely a sponge, passively absorbing the environment. It's an agent capable of filtering, prioritizing, and selecting what inputs matter. That selection process is not trivial. It becomes the architecture of your neural circuits over time. The more you direct attention deliberately, the more efficient and powerful that circuitry becomes. In time, this becomes your default. Not reactivity, but clarity. This also reduces cognitive fatigue. Much of what we think of as burn out isn't caused by doing too much. It's caused by switching attention too often. Every time you move from one task to another, especially without intention, you incur a switching cost in the brain. That means more glucose is burned, more stress hormones are released, and more mental bandwidth is wasted. But when you start the day by establishing that you are in control of your focus, you dramatically reduce that cost. You start from a place of alignment. There's also a motivational component to attention. Dopamine release is tied to goal pursuit, and goals require focus. When you choose where to place your attention, you also choose which goals your brain will invest energy in. That sets off a cascade. Dopamine is released, motivation increases, and the likelihood of follow-through rises. It's not magic, it's neuroeconomics. Your brain, like any complex system, responds to clarity with increased efficiency. This clarity affects not just your tasks, but your mood. Attention is tightly linked to emotion through the limbic system. When your attention is hijacked, you often feel anxious, overwhelmed, or passive. But when you direct attention, especially toward effortful but meaningful tasks, you generate positive emotion through forward progress. That's a dopamine loop you want to reinforce. Not one based on random stimulation, but one based on earned engagement. So the act of saying, "I control where I place my attention," becomes a neural primer. It sets the stage for every cognitive and emotional process that follows. It's not about suppressing distraction through willpower. It's about reprogramming the system from the inside out. Your brain and body are not static systems. They are dynamic, adaptive organisms designed to respond to challenge and change. From a biological standpoint, every waking moment is an opportunity to reshape your internal landscape. Neurons fire and wire together, synapses strengthen or weaken, muscles adapt to strain, and hormonal cascades recalibrate to meet the demands placed upon them. When you say to yourself, "My mind and body are designed to adapt and improve," you are not offering a motivational platitude. You are stating a scientific reality grounded in the principles of neuroplasticity, homeostasis, and hormesis. Neuroplasticity is one of the most well-established concepts in modern neuroscience. It refers to the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience, attention, and effort. But this plasticity is not automatic. It is gated by specific neuromodulators, especially acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine. These chemicals are not released randomly. They are activated by attention, novelty, and challenge. In other words, your brain changes most effectively when it is pushed to its edge, when it is forced to stretch beyond its comfort zone. The same is true for your body. Muscle fibers hypertrophy in response to mechanical load, tendons strengthen under tension, bones increase in density when exposed to stress, cardiovascular efficiency improves with repeated strain. The body adapts to the demands placed upon it, as long as those demands are progressive and consistent. This is the foundational concept behind all forms of training, and it applies just as much to cognitive and emotional processes as it does to physical ones. When you remind yourself that your system is designed to adapt and improve, you are preparing your brain to embrace challenge rather than retreat from it. You are signaling to your nervous system that discomfort is not a threat, it is a trigger. The anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex are deeply involved in the perception of effort and pain. But when you consciously reframe effort as a signal of growth, you change the way these brain regions interpret that data. You begin to build a tolerance, not just to stress, but to learning, to persistence, to failure. There's a powerful relationship between strain and learning. When you are in a state of moderate stress, what we call the optimal zone of arousal, you release norepinephrine, which heightens alertness and sensitivity to feedback. If you pair that with deliberate focus, you release acetylcholine, which sharpens your attention and helps encode new information. And if you succeed at a task or even make meaningful progress, dopamine is released. That dopamine not only makes you feel good, it also acts as a feedback signal to your brain that the pathway you're using is worth repeating. That's how learning becomes reinforcement. That's how effort becomes reward. But none of this happens in the absence of challenge. Passive experiences, where nothing is demanded of you, do not result in meaningful plasticity. It's the friction, the resistance, the tension that cues adaptation. The brain needs a reason to change. The body needs a reason to grow. Your physiology is constantly evaluating input. Is this environment safe? Is it demanding? Should I reinforce these pathways or let them degrade? Every decision you make, every habit you repeat, becomes part of that calculation. The reality is, improvement is not only possible, it's inevitable if you apply consistent, intentional effort over time. The brain is capable of creating new circuits well into adulthood. The hippocampus continues to generate new neurons. Cortical maps can reorganize themselves after injury, practice, or behavioral shifts. The myth that the brain stops changing after childhood has been thoroughly disproven. But what matters is that you take advantage of this capacity. Your beliefs play a role in this process as well. Studies in cognitive neuroscience have shown that what you believe about your ability to change actually affects your brain's capacity to do so. If you believe your intelligence, emotional regulation, or discipline are fixed, you limit the neurochemical responses that support change. But if you believe in adaptability, even if it's uncomfortable or slow, you create the conditions under which neuroplasticity is enhanced. That's not just psychology, that's biology. You also need to consider the role of sleep, nutrition, and recovery in this equation. Adaptation doesn't happen during the challenge itself. It happens after. The strain triggers the signal, but the recovery is where the change occurs. During deep sleep, for example, your brain consolidates memories, prunes unused synapses, and strengthens relevant neural pathways. Growth hormone is released, tissue is repaired. So when you tell yourself you are built to improve, you must also commit to the behaviors that allow that improvement to take hold. Another crucial factor is time. Adaptation is not instant, it's incremental. Neural circuits don't rewire after one session of practice. Muscles don't grow after one workout. You need repeated exposure to challenge, spaced across time, with the proper balance of intensity and recovery. This is known as the principle of progressive overload. It applies equally to learning calculus, mastering emotional regulation, or developing resilience. You must stay with the process long enough for the brain and body to interpret it as a consistent signal, not noise. One of the most effective ways to reinforce this mindset is through deliberate reflection. At the end of each day, take 60 seconds to identify one area where you applied effort, one instance where you encountered challenge, and one thing you improved, no matter how small. That act of reflection cues your hippocampus to tag that event as meaningful. It strengthens the neural pathways involved in growth mindset and motivation. Over time, this becomes a self-reinforcing loop. When you wake up and remind yourself that your mind and body are designed to adapt and improve, you are anchoring your identity in a biological truth. You're not declaring wishful thinking. You're aligning with how the system actually works. The human organism is not designed for stasis. It is designed for interaction, for resistance, for upward pressure. That pressure, when embraced, becomes the very thing that shapes who you are neuron by neuron, cell by cell, day by day. Stress and dopamine are often misunderstood. yet they are two of the most fundamental elements that shape human behavior, performance, and long-term development. The modern narrative often frames stress as something to be avoided and dopamine as something to be feared due to its association with addiction or impulsive behavior. But these interpretations miss the essential truth. Both stress and dopamine are highly functional biological systems designed to support adaptation, learning, and sustained effort over time. When you begin your day by telling yourself, "Stress is a tool, and dopamine is my ally," you initiate a psychological and physiological shift that positions you to meet the day's challenges with clarity and energy rather than fear or avoidance. Stress is not inherently negative. In fact, from a neurobiological standpoint, stress is what activates the systems in your brain and body that make you more alert, more focused, and more capable. When you encounter a challenge, whether it's a looming deadline, an intense conversation, or a physical demand, your hypothalamus signals the adrenal glands to release epinephrine and cortisol. These chemicals increase heart rate, elevate glucose levels, sharpen attention, and mobilize energy stores. In short, stress prepares you for action. The key is understanding the difference between acute and chronic stress. Acute stress, short-term, event-driven, is highly adaptive. It leads to increased performance, faster reaction times, and stronger memory consolidation. Chronic stress, ongoing without recovery, leads to dysregulation of the same systems, impairing cognition, immune function, and mood. The nervous system needs periods of challenge followed by periods of recovery in order to function optimally. You can think of this like a wave pattern. You ride the stress up, then you come down into calm. It's the wave itself that builds resilience. By reframing stress as functional, you also shift how your brain processes it. Studies show that individuals who believe stress is enhancing rather than harmful demonstrate more adaptive physiological responses and recover more quickly from difficult situations. The belief itself changes the biochemistry. This is because your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational evaluation, can reinterpret the same signals differently based on the narrative you apply. If you interpret elevated heart rate and mental agitation as danger, the brain shifts into a threat state. But if you interpret it as readiness or excitement, those same signals increase performance. Dopamine, likewise, is a profoundly misunderstood molecule. It is not simply the molecule of pleasure. It is the molecule of pursuit. It is released when you anticipate a reward or experience forward progress, not just when the reward is received. This is why dopamine plays such a critical role in motivation, learning, and goal-directed behavior. Every time you take action toward a meaningful goal, even a small step, your brain rewards you with a hit of dopamine. This isn't indulgence. This is reinforcement. It's your brain's way of saying, "That was useful. Do more of that." The dopamine system runs primarily through the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways, which connect the ventral tegmental area to structures like the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. These pathways evaluate the value of outcomes, assess progress toward goals, and adjust effort accordingly. What's fascinating is that dopamine release can be trained. When you learn to associate effort itself with dopamine, rather than just the end result, you build what's known as a growth-based reward system. This is a resilient system. It means that even when results are delayed or outcomes are uncertain, you still feel motivated because the process becomes the source of drive. One of the most effective ways to leverage this is through what's called dopaminergic self-tagging. This is the deliberate act of mentally recognizing and affirming progress, no matter how small, in real time. For example, if you wake up early, begin your workout, complete a hard task, or even resist a distraction, and then say to yourself, "This is me getting stronger," or "That's a win," you signal the dopaminergic system to reward that behavior. Over time, this creates a powerful internal loop where the process of effort becomes intrinsically satisfying. There's also a synergy between stress and dopamine. Moderate levels of stress increase dopamine transmission. This is part of why working under pressure can feel so stimulating and engaging. It's not that stress is enjoyable on its own. It's that it primes the brain to enter a high, alert, high reward state. But for this to be sustainable, it needs to be balanced with rest and recovery. That's where tools like deliberate breathwork, sleep deep rest, or mindful visual anchoring come into play. These practices downregulate the autonomic nervous system and create space for the stress-reward loop to reset. Dopamine also plays a role in future planning. When you set a goal and imagine the benefits of achieving it, you initiate what's known as dopaminergic ramping. This means that dopamine levels rise gradually as you make progress, which keeps you moving forward. The more vividly you can picture success and connect it to your actions, the more sustained your dopamine response. This is not fantasy. It's cognitive scaffolding that the brain uses to guide behavior over long timelines. Importantly, you can learn to become less dependent on external rewards by internalizing this mechanism. If every win has to come from outside recognition, applause, achievement, you are building a fragile system. But if you learn to trigger dopamine through internal milestones, personal standards, and commitment to values, your motivation becomes anti-fragile. It grows stronger under pressure. This is the essence of disciplined drive. When you wake up and frame both stress and dopamine as tools, systems that are part of your biology, meant to be understood and directed, you reclaim agency. You are not at the mercy of your chemistry, you are the operator. By understanding the adaptive role of stress and the motivating power of dopamine, you prepare yourself to approach challenges not with hesitation, but with a biologically grounded sense of readiness and control. Identity is not something you are born with, nor is it something fixed by genetics or childhood experience. Identity is constructed action by action, thought by thought, day by day. From a neurobiological standpoint, who you are is defined by the circuits you reinforce repeatedly. These neural circuits, bundles of neurons firing together to produce thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, are subject to change through the process of experience-dependent plasticity. That means your identity is not merely a reflection of your past, but a reflection of your present patterns. And most importantly, those patterns are shaped first and foremost by what you do, not what you intend, believe, or even feel, but by what you repeatedly enact. Each morning when you say to yourself, "I become who I practice being," you are invoking one of the most fundamental principles of neuroscience. Your brain is an organ of adaptation. It changes itself to match the demands you place upon it. If you begin your day with behaviors aligned with discipline, focus, or purpose, even in small ways, you are initiating a cascade of neural activity that reinforces those traits. You are not waiting for confidence, motivation, or clarity to arrive. You are generating it through action. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and planning, becomes more active when you take goal-directed steps, even if those steps feel uncomfortable or uncertain. That activity, repeated, forms new circuits. Those circuits become traits. Those traits become your identity. The mistake most people make is waiting for internal alignment before they act. They wait until they feel ready or they believe they are that kind of person, before they behave in accordance with a new self-image. But in the brain, behavior precedes belief. Repetition of action builds a foundation upon which belief can later rest. When you force yourself to do the hard thing, the focused thing, the uncomfortable thing, you're sending a signal to your nervous system. This is what matters now. And your brain responds by increasing the salience of those actions and downregulating the alternatives. Even the smallest behaviors, if repeated consistently, begin to shift identity. Making your bed each morning, journaling your thoughts, stepping outside for a walk, putting your phone down when you want to reach for it, all of these are micro signals. They are cues your brain uses to construct an internal narrative about who you are. These narratives don't exist in a vacuum. They are coded in neural circuitry. The basal ganglia, which control habit formation and automatic behavior, rely heavily on repetition. The more you perform a behavior, the less energy it requires. Over time, the identity associated with that behavior becomes implicit. You don't have to remind yourself you are someone who trains, someone who studies, someone who resists distraction. It becomes automated. And when identity is automated, effort becomes less necessary for consistency. Another essential factor is the role of internal self-talk. How you speak to yourself, especially during effort, modulates activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in error detection and emotional regulation. If you tell yourself, "This is who I am now," in the moments when you are exerting effort, your brain begins to link effort with identity. This link is crucial. It means that even before you see results, even before you feel a change, your nervous system is adapting to a new internal story. And that story isn't fantasy. It's rooted in the actual behaviors you perform.